All right, class. Today we'll finish chapter 4. So you can think about this is the class for 2020. So in the last class, we actually stopped here and we're trying to explain that when the asset is more than liabilities and equities, what the corporation should do. So basically, the corporation should seek for external financing. And I also give you some hints that what they should if the asset is less than liabilities and equities. So let's talk about that in detail, and let's start with a realistic assumptions or example that can make the corporations to have less assets than liabilities and equities. So basically, let's say in 2018, this was our historical sales, $5,000, okay? And let's say the corporation or the company, Tasha Troy, is only using 80% of the asset capacity to generate these sales. So that means if they have 100 assets, they're only using 80 assets to generate this sales value of $5,000. So if there is only 80% capacity, that means how much sales they can generate in their full capacity, 100% of capacity. So we can do this by dividing $5,000 by 0.8. So basically, in full capacity, the company can generate $6,250 amount of sales. Okay, and next year projection is only 5,500. So that means from this year to next year, if this company is growing to 5,500 from 5,000, the company would not need the full capacity of assets because their full capacity can generate $6,250 of sales. So that being said, for this growth, we should not need an investment on the fixed assets because we still have the capacity to achieve this growth without investing in the fixed assets. On these triggers, this fixed asset value should not change. This fixed asset value should be 5,000 for the next year because we don't need any additional investment in the fixed assets. If this is true, this value will be lower, right? 12,150. If you look here, right? 12,150. Right now, we have liabilities and equities of 12,372. So more liabilities and equities than needed. So that means those additional, if you deduct 12,150 from 12,372, we have additional $222 worth of financing than needed. What you can do? I answered in the last class. We can reduce debt, we can reduce equity, we can pay more dividends so that we can make the balance sheet balance. So here's the answer. Excess financing, decrease notes payable, decrease long-term debt, buy back some stocks, pay more dividends. Now, why this assumption is important, like the capacity information, like how much capacity the company is utilizing right now, like 50%, 80%, 100%, why this is important. I think I talked about it several times. This is important because that helps you to decide that company needs any additional investment in fixed assets or not, okay? So basically that helps you to decide whether these values should be like last year, this value should be more or what, okay? And due to that, do we need any financing or not? So far, so good. Let's do some 1 or 2 sample questions. So I encourage whenever I do any sample questions in the recorded lectures, you guys pause the video and try to do it by yourself and then match it with me, okay? So pause the video and do it by yourself first. So this is trying to tell you current sales is $5,000, okay? Profit margin, PM, is basically 6%. So that means profit or net profit should be 6,000. I'm sorry, it should be 5,000 times 0.6. So this is current profit, right? So this is current profit, this year profit. The firm estimate that sales will increase by 7% next year. So this is current year. So next year sales should be, next year should be 5,000 times 1.07. So that should be 5,350. And then if all vary with sales, what is the pro forma net income? So that means we should use the same profit margin with the next year sales. So the pro forma net income is basically 5,350 times 0.06. That's it. That's the answer. That's the answer. So far, we talked about pro forma, which is projections, and I told you the most important thing is the growth rate. So now we're going to talk about some different types of growth rate. I think we went over this. You guys just read this slide at your own. So basically, when we talk about growth, we need investment in fixed assets, and we may need external financing. Okay, so we talked about that. So now let's talk about two different growth rate formulas of growth rate proxies. They are known as internal growth rate and sustainable growth rate. So when you talk about internal growth rate, so the name has the definition. So this is the growth rate you can achieve internally. So that means this is the growth rate you can achieve by investing in assets using your retained earnings. So retained earnings is basically your internally generated cash flow. So let's think of this way. If you invest in an asset that's generating some profit, this is internally generated cash flows because you are not borrowing from outside by issuing debt liquidity. That is your externally generated cash flows. Okay. So internal growth rate means by investing in assets from the source of retained earnings, internally generated cash flows, how much you can grow. Okay. So this is called internal growth rate. There are some assumptions. So internal growth rate assumes that dividend payout ratio will be constant. So that means in history, if your payout was 40%, in future your payout should be 40% too. It is not going to change. That's one of the assumptions. Okay. And also the thing is that the source of cash flow is retained earnings. And this is the formula for internally generated cash flow. So return on asset is basically net profit divided by total assets. This is retention ratio. If you can think about retention ratio means retained earnings divided by net income. Okay. And you can also find this ratio from 1 minus dividend payout ratio, because I told you dividend payout ratio plus retention ratio is 100% or 1, because the ratio is calculated in a way which shows you what is the usage of net income. And I told you the usage of net income has two. One is pay dividend and second one is written within the fund. So this is retention ratio. You can either calculate retained earnings divided by net profit or minus dividend payout ratio. Using the Tasha Troy Emporium statements, the last statements we did. So historical ROA is basically, this is net profit 1185, total asset 11,500. Net profit, total assets. Okay. And they told you payout is 40. That means 60 is written down in 60%. So here is the thing. 0.1030, plug it in here. 0.6, plug it in here, plug in information, 6.6%. Make sense? Now pause the video again and do it by yourself. Then I'm gonna go over this. So it's trying to tell you expected sales 50,000 next year, profit margin 3%, payout ratio 30%, projected increase in retained earnings. That means projected sales 50,000, profit 50,000 times 0.03, so that should be 1,500. And then payout ratio is 30%. So dividend should be then dividend should be then from profit 1500 times 0.3, 450. Projected increase in return earnings. So increase in return earnings or addition in return earnings. You can do two ways. 1500 minus 450 or 1500 times 0.7, because 30% is payout, 70% is addition to return earnings. Both gonna give you same result. So that's it. Second type of growth rate, sustainable growth rate. It tells that by using internally generated funds and only issuing debt, how much growth you can generate. So basically, let's say we generated some profit, we paid some dividend, kept some within the firm, okay? So by keeping that internal generated cash flow, and if you keep the internal generated cash flow, your equity will go up, right? Because we learned from this example. If you do internal generated cash flows, if you keep the internal generated cash flows, your equity will go up, right? So debt equity ratio will adjust accordingly. So the idea is you'll keep the return earnings and issue debt proportionally so that debt equity ratio do not change. Using debt and internally generated cash flow, how much growth you can achieve, that is sustainable growth rate. Same thing, dividend payout ratio is constant and no new external equity is issued. You cannot issue new equity. Only thing you can do, keep the internal generated cash flows and issue debt proportionally so that debt and equity ratio is constant. This is the formula, return on equity, which is net profit divided by total equity times retention ratio. So just use the formula. So this is the net profit from that example. This is the total equity from that example. 40% payout, 60% retention, plug in the formula, that should be the sustainable growth rate. Okay. Now let's do these two problems. Then we are almost pretty close to this chapter. So internal growth rate, right? Be careful with the formula. Internal growth rate is basically IGR is basically ROA times P divided by 1 minus ROA times P, okay? Now be careful. You should work with this one first, ROA times B, then do the 1 minus, okay? Because if you do mathematical operations, multiplication will be done first, then subtraction, okay? Now calculate return on asset from this example, okay? So net income 3,000, total equity of 8,500, debt equity ratio is 0.7, payout ratio 20. So payout ratio 0.20 means retention 80%, right? Or 0.8, right? But there is no direct information of return on asset, but we have to find out return on asset. So return on asset is basically net profit divided by total asset. But they gave us the net profit, $3,000, but they did not give us total asset. So they give us $3,000, but did not give us total asset. So what they give, total equity, 8,500, plus debt equity ratio of 0.7%. So that means for each $1 of equity, you have 70 cents of debt. For each $1 of equity, you have 70 cents of debt. So what do we have? We have equity. We have equity times 0.7, which is the debt, because for each $1 of asset, equity, sorry, not asset, you have 0.7 debt, 0.7 of debt. So now this will give you 3,000 divided by, let's see, 14450. So that should be equal to 20.76% or 0.76. I always recommend when you're doing percentage problem, always use decimal type, okay? Always use this, okay? That's what I recommend. That's a segment. So that means 0.2076 times 0.8 divided by 1 minus 0.2076 times 0.8. That's it. It should give you 1.9 or 19.2%. Make sense? So that's the IGR. I'm deleting all of these so that we can do SGR, sustainable growth rates. Let's make it a little easy. So your SGR should be ROE and then ROE, right? So all else said. So, okay. So now it's trying to tell you 65% is payout. So that means retention, 35% or 0.35, okay? Now, return on equity information is not given. It's given you 5% profit margin, and then total asset turnover 1.3, equity multiplier 1.7. So basically from DuPont analysis, we know that return on equity is basically profit margin times total asset turnover times equity multiplier. So that means profit margin times asset turnover times equity multiplier. So that means if you do that, 0.05 times 1.7 times 1.3, 0.1105, sorry, it should becomes here. It should be, sorry, it should be here. So that's your return on equity, right? Now plug in the formula. So return on equity is basically, it should be 0.1105 times 0.35 divided by 1 minus 0.1105 times 0.35. That's it. And I think that's going to give you 0.0402 or 4.02%. So that's IGR, SGR. So I think we have talked about this. What are some determinants of growth? Your profit margin, because that affect your return on asset or equity, your total asset turnover, yes, and your choice of financing, like debt versus equity, okay? And also, do you want to keep the money within the firm, or you want to basically pay a dividend? So these are some factors or determinants of growth. So basically, we're done with chapter 4 today, but let's have a quick recap of whatever homework left. So far we did until this point, like problem 7. Now let's talk about return on equity. So we know that return on equity is basically a function of net profit divided by total equity, right? But there is not that information. So from DuPont, we can do return on equity is basically profit margin times total asset turnover times what else? Equity multiplier. So profit margin from here is basically, we don't know. Profit margin is basically 7 million divided by 100 million. Total asset turnover is basically 100 million divided by 90 million. And then equity multiplier is given, which is 1.2. So on that triggered, calculate that. So 0.07 times 1.11 times 1.2. So what do you got? 0.0933. That's your equity, or 9.3%. Define internal and sustainable growth rate. We learned it today, right? So it's trying to tell you, one is trying to tell you by only using the internal generated cash flows, how much growth rate you can achieve. And the other is trying to tell you, do not issue new equity, but only using internal generated cash flows and some new debt issues, how much growth rate you can achieve, right? And now it's asking for how to calculate IGR and SGR. Very easy. IGR, you know the formula, right? So the formula should be, let's copy from here. IGR formula is here. That should be ROA, right? So return on asset is given 9%, okay? Return on equity, dividend payout ratio 75%. So that means retention is 25. So that's given. So just plug in the values, okay? SGR. Return on equity is given, B is 25%, plug in the values. Implication of firm's operation at or less than the full capacity, right? So basically, full capacity means how much assets you are using to generate sales. If you are working at full capacity, for additional growth, you need to invest in fixed asset. If you're not working at full capacity for additional growth, you don't need to invest in fixed assets. That's it. So we're done with chapter 4. We are done with all the homework. So good luck. So in the next class, we'll start chapter 5. Thank you.